Hi, welcome back. So today we are talking about Plato, and to sort of get us into where we're going to be heading now for the next few lectures. I want to sort of give a background to some of the philosophical problems that people like Plato were dealing with, and you probably got a sense of some of this when we talked about Socrates. But we're gonna dive more directly into these questions. So this very first slide, the title slide here, we have a picture drawn, or excuse me, painted by David, the French painter during the French Revolution, during the period of the French Revolution, the part of the sort of neoclassicist, sort of genre of painting. And we see here a depiction of the death of Socrates. Okay, so there in the middle, you see Socrates about to take the poisonous hemlocks. If you recall from our discussion of Socrates with the Apology, that was his trial, right? And here we have the death scene. So he was tried and sentenced to death, and then we have the death scene with Plato's friends around him in the jail cell as he's preparing to drink the poisonous hemlock. So Plato, right, talked about how philosophy, right, the purpose of philosophy is a preparation for death. Okay, well, what does that mean to say that it's a preparation for death? Well, if we think about what sort of life is about, and if we think about sort of the reasons that we potentially fear death, it's usually because we consider sort of our current existence to be good in some way, or we fear that at death there's going to be significant pain, or we fear maybe an afterlife, or something, right? But we consider the present to be good, right? Our present life to be good. And Plato rejected that for several reasons, and one of these is that he said that the philosopher, right, the philosopher should be eager for death, because the philosopher should live in sort of this intellectual realm. So we're going to sort of see what this is about, what he's sort of talking about. So we're going to look at several sort of problems that Plato tried to sort of deal with. So first of all, I apologize. The slides are not moving out very quickly. Okay. So first of all, I have this video here about the problem of identity, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. So it presents some very interesting sort of questions about what it means for something to continue to exist, right? You've probably heard that sort of the human body, after about 5 years, has basically turned over all of its material, right? The cells have been replaced, more or less, right? So, what does it mean for me to say I'm still Jamal, and how am I different or the same that I was 5 years ago? That's not that long ago. It seems that I'm mostly the same, right? Well, perhaps, or perhaps not, right? And I think that thinking about that question about how our identities, sort of persist over time is a very sort of interesting question to think about. It's a question that Plato is very interested in. How is it that we as human beings, um, you know, have any permanence whatsoever? Um, so if we look at the background a little bit of Plato, he was the student of Socrates. You see his dates there in the notes part. Born somewhere between 428, 423 BCE, and then he died somewhere between 348 and 347 BCE. And Alfred North Whitehead um, once stated, and you see this quote there in the notes, that basically all of the history of Western philosophy could be considered a footnote to Plato, right? So that's an interesting sort of statement to make, and I think as we look at the problems that he presents, I think we can see what exactly it is that Whitehead, Alfred North Whitehead, meant by that statement. So let's take a look at those problems. So at the beginning of Plato's career, his writing career, this on slide 4, he started off by portraying or trying to portray Socrates as he was, right? Socrates, the sort of wandering philosopher, and so he presented him, in a very sort of courageous, but also very, I think, clear fashion, showing that Socrates was one of these figures that often gets themselves in trouble. It was sort of inevitable based on the questioning that Socrates developed that he would get himself in trouble. And so, why is that, right? Why did he end up getting himself in trouble? And we're going to talk about, we talked about that a little bit, but we're going to talk about how Plato's sort of thought, really shifts Greece away from sort of the religious thinking that had been occurring to a very different way of thinking about reality, about sort of the afterlife, about the divine. Later in Plato's career, after he began to sort of develop himself as a philosopher, he began to write dialogues that sort of used used Socrates as a character in his plays, in his dialogues, and he used the character, right, no longer the individual Socrates, but the character of Socrates to present Plato's own theories, or at least that's sort of the assumption that we have. Okay. So, Plato, what Plato tried to do was he tried to deal with the philosophical path that he was presented with. So the physical problems that Plato dealt with were these two different schools of thought. One which is presented by Heraclitus, which said that everything is in constant change. The other one, which was presented by the Eleatics, who said that change is impossible. So looking first at the Eleatics. So the primary philosophers in this tradition, were Parmenides and Zeno. Parmenides dates there 415 BCE to 460 BCE, Zeno 490 to 430 BCE. Their views were that all is one and that change is impossible. Change that we see is just an illusion, right? It's illusory. All right, and you probably heard the Zeno's arrow paradox. And and if we sort of think through what this is, what the paradox, what Zeno says is if you sort of shoot an arrow, across the room or at a target, right? You sort of shoot this arrow at the target. He said that based on this paradox, the arrow will never get to the target, right? Why is that? Well, that's because before it gets to the target, it has to make it halfway, right? And before it gets halfway to there, it has to go halfway, right? And before it gets halfway there, it has to go halfway, right? You sort of continue to get this dividing in half, right, over and over again, infinitely. And so since it's always going to have to go through these points, it seems as though these points go on, or it can be divided up in an infinite sort of way. So therefore, the arrow will never make it to the target. So that's the Zeno's arrow paradox. Now there's a sort of a problem with this in that a point is sort of a mathematical construction, right? It is not real in the actual world, right? Points don't actually exist in sort of the world of appearances, but they exist as a mathematical sort of tool. But anyway, that's the Zeno's paradox. Heraclitus. So on to slide 7. Heraclitus says that all things are in constant flux, right? The reason they have the sort of the picture of a river here is because he said famously that one can never step into the same river twice. Right? Why is that? Well, it's for a couple of reasons. One, the river's always changing, the water's flowing. It's never the same water that was there before. And additionally, I'm always changing, or you're always changing, right? The person stepping in the river is always changing as well. So there's this constant change that is that's occurring, that goes on. Okay. So we get these opposite positions. So moving on to slide 8, we get these opposite positions. Either everything is changing all the time, or change seems to be impossible. And Plato tried to come up with a solution to that. And he came up with a solution in what he calls the theory of forms. Okay. So to sort of think through this theory of forms, let's take a look at this next slide. Slide 10. So slide 10, we have these various lines, right? And I can ask you, okay, which of these lines appears most equal? And, probably the two on the left appear to be more equal than the two on the right, right? And you can recognize that. Now, if you look really closely, I imagine that you'd be able to see that the two on the left are not perfectly equal. I tried to make them as equal as possible. I don't know how, if I succeeded or not. I didn't copy and paste them, I don't believe. I actually can't remember what I did. But you'd probably be able to see some sort of difference. Or if you can't see it, you'd probably be able to find some sort of difference by, by analyzing it in some way, right? Now, if you think of when Plato was writing, right, we didn't have computers, right? So he might give the same example by drawing some lines in the sand, right, or in the dirt. And you're never going to be able to sort of get those absolutely the same, right? Perfectly equal. But what Plato says in his dialogue, the Phaedo, what he sort of points out is that while we can't actually sort of create two equal lines, perfectly equal lines, what we can do is we can evaluate those, and we can evaluate those based on this idea of equality. So what do we mean? Well, we recognize that no two things are ever perfectly equal, right? Sort of if you look at each of the sort of lenses in my glasses, right? They're not perfectly the same. You can sort of look at them and find differences in them, right? Sort of the size, the symmetry, things, right? There's always going to be things are going to be slightly off. But the fact that we can make that evaluation and show how two things are insufficient in their equality means that we must have an idea of equality, right? We have to have the idea to compare those things against. But we never experienced, right, that equality, right? So we lack the experience of perfect equality, but we have the concept of perfect equality. And our general way of understanding how we develop ideas or concepts is that we learn them through our experience of the world, right? That's the sort of how do I learn what trees look like? Well, my parents said this is a tree and that's a tree, and and I sort of got that over and over again. Eventually, I was able to recognize trees, right? And I got the concept, the idea of a tree in my head. But with something like equality, that doesn't exactly make sense. So how is it I'm able to make that evaluation? And Plato would say, well, even if you sort of think of it as a mathematical concept, right? You're going to understand this without being sort of formally taught mathematics. Okay, so we have, how do I understand that 2 and 2 are equal in terms of numbers, right? If I've never sort of experienced, 2 and 2 perfectly equal things. And so he says that we have the concept of it, and that concept must have existed prior to our experience, right? Prior to any experience whatsoever. So what does that mean, right? What does that mean? Well, that means for Plato, what that means is that we were born with it, right? We had it at birth, prior to our experience. And what it points to for Plato is it points to this sort of world of forms. Okay. So if you go to slide 11, he's got this argument, and this is again from the Phaedo, P-H-A-E. Well, I can write it up here on the board. I have the chalkboard with me. Phaedo, dialogue with Phaedo. So in that dialogue, Plato develops this theory, right? This is what the theory looks like. So things of this world appear equal, are in fact deficient in the equality they have. Therefore, they're not the same as true equality, that is, the equal itself. To recognize this deficiency, we need to think about the equal itself. To think about the equal itself, we must have prior knowledge of it. But this knowledge did not come from our senses or from perceiving things, so it must have come from before we developed sense perception, before our birth. Therefore, our souls existed prior to us being born. So this is his theory of recollection. And we're not going to sort of go too much into this sort of notion of immortality right now. But what I'd like to do is sort of pick up on this notion of the equal itself. What is he talking about with the equal itself? Well, Plato believed that there was this world of forms. So if we move to slide 12, I'm going to sort of look at this in slide 12, 13, and 14. So slide 12. So slide 12 here we have, a bunch of different triangles. And we recognize them as triangles, even though they're all very different. For Plato, we had to have had a prior concept of triangle, to plug in the particular triangles that we see, right, to sort of make sense of them as triangles. And to be able to recognize each of these, despite being very different, also being, sort of representing, right, being examples of triangles. And what Plato would say is, well, there must be a perfect triangle, the concept of triangle, which exists independent, right, not dependent on these examples, which makes sense, right? As a mathematical concept, as a geometric concept, there is the idea of triangle, the concept of triangle that exists independent of these triangles, right? That does not depend on these particular, sort of instantiations of the triangle. All right, next slide. On to 13. So we look at these, right? We have these various pictures, right? And each of them express the color red. What is it that these various examples share, right? Is each red here independent? Is each red separate? Or are they all examples of one color red, right? Are they all examples of the color red? And if they're examples of the color red, does that mean then that the color exists independent of these, right? If they exist, if the color red exists independent of these, well, where the heck does that exist, right? Where, where does the color red actually exist? And I think, I think that this is sort of the problem that Plato is looking to try to solve. It's a problem we now call the problem of universals. All right, and then finally 14. So we had sort of geometric shape of triangle. Where does this sort of idea of the triangle exist? Where does the color red exist if it's independent of the particular examples? And then finally apple, right? So here we have examples of apples, right? Very different in color and shape and so on, right? Probably very different flavor. Call them all apples, right? The fact that they're all apples, does that mean then that the idea of appleness exists independent of these particular apples? Right? And how is it we're able to recognize these as each as apples without having an idea which precedes in some way the apple itself? Okay. So with all of these, right, and here a horse is a horse, right? When we say that an animal is a horse, so this is 15, slide 15. When we say an animal is a horse, how are we able to recognize it as a horse? Okay, what's the way in which we're able to recognize it as a horse? And for Plato, the reason we're able to recognize it as a horse and be able to sort of plug it into a concept is because the concept itself preceded the experience, first of all, of the horse itself, and then horses themselves, right? And so for Plato, there's this world in which ideas, concepts exist that has lasted forever. So if we move to slide 16, this is a sort of this sort of theory of forms presented here. Okay, so we have the world of appearance, and we have the world of reality, right? The world of reality is the world of concepts. So the perfect chair, or the perfect tree, perfect coffee mug, right? The perfect horse, the perfect apple, the perfect color red, the perfect triangle, all those things, right? They all exist in this sort of perfect realm, and the particular ones we see out in the world are just copies of that perfect one in the first place. Then we move up, we see sort of these higher forms, things like equality, right? Justice, geometry, mathematical concepts, right? That notion of equality that we talked about, right? That's a sort of resides here in this other sort of realm. And the reason that we can use it is because we have access. We're able to, through our intellect, through our mind, able to access this realm of concepts. And then finally, we have the form of the good, right? The good form of the good is what provides reality to the rest of the concepts. Okay. So, and there's a lot of sort of questions about what exactly this means and how it is that the appearances appear, right? Are they appearing through our minds, or are we sort of seeing them and plugging it into something, or what is it exactly? Let's see here. So if we look at the different qualities, so this is 17 of each of these realms, right? We have the world of forms, which is intellectual, it's perfect, it's the mind, it's independent, it's creative, it's known and understood, it's infinite, eternal, and unchanging. The world of appearances, on the other hand, is a world that is sensible, it's imperfect, it's the realm of the body, it's dependent, it's created, seen and believed, right, rather than known. It's finite, it's in space and time, and changing. So these are two different ways of categorizing reality, right? We have the world of forms and the world of appearances. And so we see how this attempted to solve the problem that we saw with the pre-Socratics, right? So the problem with the Eleatics and Heraclitus. So the problem of the sort of no change and the problem of perpetual flux. And what Plato says is like, well, the realm of perpetual flux, what that is this world of appearances. The realm of forms, right? That's the realm of permanence, of no change. Okay. So that's the theory of forms. Now, one of the places, so we moved to 18, one of the places that Plato, develops his notion of mind, soul, and further develops his notion of forms is in the Republic, which is what the reading is from. And so Plato is concerned with several things in the Republic. First of all, and most importantly, he's concerned with this notion of justice, defining justice. We talked a bit about this before, but the way he defines justice is proper ordering of the soul, right? So we think of the way that make sure that the role of the individual is proper within society. So this sort of political question is at the forefront of sort of a metaphysical question as well. Okay. Slide 20, I put a video or a link to a video there, so you can go ahead and take a look at that. Just looking at the question of the allegory of the cave, which we're going to talk about next. So 21, we have here a depiction of the cave, of Plato's cave, and so in the Republic, we get a description of this sort of cave in which various prisoners have been chained up and are forced to face this wall. And behind them, right behind them, there's these puppeteers that march back and forth behind them, right? And it sort of casts shadows onto the wall. There's this sort of fire that's behind the puppeteers, and so they're able to create these shadows up on the wall. All right, so this is the reality that that these individuals have sort of seen. They've seen this world of shadows, and so one of them gets loose, right, and is either let loose or gets loose and goes up out of the cave. At first, the experience is very disorienting, but eventually, the person is able to sort of, adjust their eyes and be able to see things in light, and see sort of what reality is all about. And of course, this is pretty overwhelming, but as they get used to it, they, eventually able to experience the sun, directly. And so understand sort of what reality is all about, right? And so, so that's sort of, the sort of escaped prisoner. Now, of course, the sort of escaped prisoner wants to go and sort of let everyone else know what this is all about as well, right? Sort of let people in on this new bit of knowledge that the escaped prisoner has found out, and tries to go and sort of tell people about what's happened, what's sort of going on outside the cave, and let them out. And they resist, and and are unwilling to sort of to sort of leave, right? To sort of try to experience reality as it is, right? And say, no, this is reality that's right in front of us, right? The shadows, that's true reality. And so we get this sort of allegory concerning the various sort of aspects of the theory of form. So if you look at 22 or 23, actually go on to 23, we see the allegory, right? So the sun represents the good. We have the outside world, which represents the world of the forms. The escaped prisoner represents Socrates, right? Trying to sort of inform people of this reality. We have the cave, which represents the world of appearances. And then we have the shadows, which represent the particulars. So that's sort of the reality the purpose of this allegory is to explain sort of Plato's notion of the forms. Okay. So that's basically the basic understanding of what sort of the world of forms is, the theory of forms is for Plato, and what we get out of this in a lot of ways is this sort of notion of Platonic dualism, which has become sort of a very central part of Western thought, right? Of dividing the world up in this sort of dualistic manner. And I think this is a huge part of what Whitehead is talking about when he talks about European thought being but a footnote to Plato. It's this dualism, right? This sort of self-other, inside-outside, subjective, objective, sort of way of dividing up the world. Okay. So what about justice? Let's talk a little bit more about that, right? So the reading, has this sort of story, right? Says, okay, let's imagine, right? Let's imagine that you've been given this ring, right? And if you sort of turn the ring in this certain sort of way, it will make you invisible, right? You'll disappear. So the question is, with this sort of power, if you're able to do this, what would you do with this power, right? And Plato says, right? Plato says that a person, um, if there are two of these rings, and one's put on the finger of a just person and one's put on the finger of an unjust person, um, that the unjust person, yeah, will use it for evil, right? But the just person will use the ring for good, right? And why is that? Well, according to Plato, the truly just person is um, no longer concerned with things like honor and wealth and so on, right? They're concerned only with things of the mind, only with things of sort of the other world, the world of forms, right? The world of the good. And so there's no longer going to be sort of interest or concern for for the just person in the realm of appearances. Okay. So Plato's discussion of democracy, I just want to sort of point a couple other things out. So if you go to slide 29, you'll see that Plato doesn't have a very good view of democracy. So Plato says that sort of the proper ordering of society, right, is a society that has people performing the functions that work best for their sort of temperament. And he says there are some people that sort of are disinterested type people, and some of those disinterested people, um, you know, would make good rulers. They are disinterested in sort of things benefiting them, and would act only in a just and beneficial way to the society they live in. So that those people ought to be the rulers of society. And these are who Plato call the philosopher kings. And realize that for Plato, proper knowledge of the good will lead one to being a good individual. Okay, so good epistemology or good knowledge will lead you to being a good person. And then within the same society, there will be people who are passionate, right? But they're passionate in a way that means that, yeah, they are concerned with honor, but they're also concerned with doing the good for society. And so these would be the warrior class according to Plato. And then finally, we have the class of commoners, and the sort of class of commoners would be the ones that would produce material, sort of wealth for society. They would be the ones that own property, you know, and it's sort of their role to be ruled and guided by the other two classes. So this is the appropriate aristocracy according to Plato, and this is the best form of government. But eventually, when rulers become self-interested, it devolves into what Plato calls a timocracy. It's a sort of sort of expert-based government, and then that will devolve eventually into an oligarchy once the ruling classes are permitted to have power. When they become concerned with power and permitted to have money and wealth, right? And because this sort of turns into something, that's fairly bad for society, eventually there will be a point where this oligarchy will be overthrown and will devolve into a democracy or rule by the people. And this is when the commoners gain full control of society. And this, for Plato, is bad, right? This can't be good because the commoners aren't properly ordered. Their souls are not in the right order, and it's just going to turn into chaos. And so, because of this chaos that results, those in this society will eventually seek stability, which will lead people to ask for a strong ruler, a rigid ruler, and a tyranny will arise. So this is sort of the theory of devolving forms of government according to Plato. But the best form of government for Plato is an aristocracy. Right. Last slide 30. How does this sort of this notion of the self, the soul, and society sort of correlate with one another? For Plato, they mirror one another, right? The proper ordering of the soul should be the rational part controlling the passionate or spirited part, which in turn controls the appetitive part, right? Which should mirror the proper ordering of society, with the philosopher king ruling the warrior class and the warrior class ruling the commoners. So that's Plato. So Plato, again, a very important figure in Western thought. And I think that Whitehead was correct to say that the rest of Western thought must take Plato seriously, and either answer him if they don't agree with Plato, must at least answer Plato. So that's Plato. So next time we'll pick up some Aristotle and see where that takes us. So we'll see you then.